Dear colleagues, I'm especially pleased to be here with you for this conference on Complex Systems 2015. In two previous conferences, I presented the paper The Future of the Human-Trace, a Substantial Societal Challenge, published in Networks and Communication Studies, Volume 28/201. And at some events organised by the e-lab in 2014. This time I'm putting forward an approach which aims to illustrate the human trace paradigm to a very diverse audience. The Ignos Anthropos, or the Foundations of a Humanism of Trace. The explosion of multidisciplinary research works on trace has led to the precision here in a language that is transversal to academic disciplines and players, what we call the Ignos Anthropos. This new French anthropological paradigm is likely to found decisive anthroposemiotics, when the veil must be lifted on the processes that produce what ordinary language calls trace. This procedure would appear essential in a context where use of the term trace is spreading to all fields, without its real meaning being fixed. Let us cite as an example of frequent usage digital traces, or cognitive traces, or traces of pollution, etc. We have explored these different areas, as well as the difference between trace, imprint, or mark in different works and articles. We will not return to this point here. We invite interested parties to refer to our publications in CNRS Edition or Intellectica. Let us dwell for a moment on what we said at the 4th International Conference of Unitwin Complex Systems Unesco. The question of the trace as an object of research in the context of complex systems comes so naturally in terms of multidisciplinarity. To articulate all these approaches, without merging them, we propose to gradually build an innovative form of research networks around the subject of trace, taking advantage of the framework established by CSDC UNESCO Unitwin. Last year, we presented the human trace paradigm in the following way. The French paradigm of human trace posits that man is both a producer of traces and a construct of traces, operating in a loop, a system in which each builds the other in a continuum. For more information, please refer to the text of the e-session 2014, Open Source, by Béatrice Galinon-Melenec, The Future of the Human-Trace, a Substantial Societal Challenge, in Networks and Communication Studies, Volume 28. In consequence, the presentation of this e-session 2015 addresses a diverse audience. Scientific terms specific to the speciality will therefore be avoided. Last year, we presented the human trace paradigm in the following way. The French paradigm of human trace posits that man is both a producer of traces and a construct of traces, operating in a loop, a system in which each builds the other in a continuum. Human beings have sought trace by trace to go back in time to the origins of the universe, and this search is evidence of the essential role held by trace in the minds of all humans seeking to understand their place in evolution. Today, the quest culminates in the past, dating to between 10 and 15 billion years, estimations vary, where there was only unorganized matter, a mush burning at billions of degrees. Current knowledge stops at this stage, known as the Big Bang. As there is no trace of what came before, the postulate tends to be the hypothesis that the Big Bang was the origin of the universe. The framework has been laid. Trace retraces time from trace to trace. Before going on, it is to be noted that it is because we integrate the logic of trace, we cannot go beyond the Big Bang. But this does not prove that by using another form of logic, it would not be possible to gain access to what happened before the Big Bang. This being said, and since it is the logic of trace that prevails at the moment, let us follow it step by step. In this perspective, it seems relevant to cite Derrida. Every trace is a trace of a trace. No element is never present anywhere, nor simply absent. There are only traces. Derrida and Bennington, 1991. Trace is one of the most important concepts in deconstruction. In the 1960s, Derrida used this word in Writing and Difference and Of Grammatology. For him, the meaning of a sign is generated from the difference, and the sign itself contains a trace of what it does not mean. Our echoing of sign trace analyzes this process of construction of meaning. The process is permanent, only the result changes. We must specify that for our part we have used the term trace because it is a term in common usage and considered as part of the collective perception, which, although polysemous, can introduce the subject in question. But in fact, we should distinguish the visible trace, which we call signe trace, sign trace, from the trace processuelle, processual trace. By sign trace, we mean that what we can see at the present instance merits the term sign as much as the term trace. We of course remember Roland Barthes' warning that what happens in opposition to signs and outside signs is quickly identified as a sign. But we maintain that the sign contains more than what it appears to contain, which is the process that constructed it and from which it issues, the processual trace. The sign that we can see comprises an ambiguous in-between status, in which it is, in the present, the manifestation of a process of transformation. Thus, the process, the processual trace, that constructs the sign becomes invisible to the immediate eye. In order to enable the immediate eye to distance itself from the appearance of the sign, we call the sign sign trace. One might even consider that it is an implicit idea of association of the sign as a processual trace, and therefore of a sign trace, that the paleontologist or astrophysicist, to mention only these two scientific disciplines, have been able to reconstruct sign trace after sign trace the history of humanity or the history of the cosmos. The world in which we live is therefore constructed of processual traces, and what we see are sign traces. We posit that the principle of processual traces is apparent everywhere, in matter as well as in any life, at least since the Big Bang, given that we know of nothing before then. The conclusion is that if, since the Big Bang, the universe has become more and more complex, the present as a whole bears the processual traces of this complexity, which continues its development. Hence, the interest we have in locating the question of trace within a complex context. Researchers observing contemporary society, its culture and techniques, can also analyse it from the perspective of trace. We have opened up an avenue for research in positing that any human can be considered both as a construct of traces and as a producer of traces, the whole forming one system, which is what we have named the paradigm of the human trace. In this e-session 2015, we are proposing an explanation of the human trace paradigm, with illustrations of book covers of those works cited as references. In this work, we present the process of echoing of sign traces. To explain that a communication, in other words, the impossibility to communicate perfectly, finds its source in the difference between the life histories of individuals in relationships, incorporated histories, and which even when invisible act on behaviours that constitute a particular form of sign traces. Integrating the corporeal dimension of trace can be a pragmatic way of transposing questions on Derrida's différance with an A to what forms the basis of the relationship between humans. The 20th century provided a great deal in the way of helping us to understand our origins. The history of the world appeared more clearly to us and taught humans that they were the result of an evolution that began with the universe. The first particles, the atoms, molecules, stars, cells, organisms, living beings, right up to the curious animals that we are. They all follow one another in the same chain. They are all carried along by the same movement. With the precision, the elements that make up our bodies are those that formerly founded the universe. We base our argument on this breakthrough in science and on the inescapable corporeal dimension of human beings to illustrate our definition of the ichnos anthropos, or Human-Trace, human trace. This signifies that every human being's body includes traces, not only of the whole history of evolution, but also those of all interactions with the environment since birth, and even traces of those that precede it in his or her genealogy. In this sense, we can therefore say that humans are a construct of traces, but they are not only that. Everybody can observe that they produce a minima, traces of respiration in space, and consequently modify it, and as soon as they move, they produce traces of their displacement. Obviously, the traces produced by human beings are more numerous than primary traces. We can also distinguish secondary traces, amongst which there are the technical ones, also called artifact sign traces, and tertiary traces, for example, the rules of law, which are produced by humans with a view to regulating their relationships. This term has been translated into English by the human trace and more generally by ichnos anthropos. Ichnos meaning trace, anthropos, man. The definition of the human trace, Human-Trace, functions perfectly well when one studies the history of humanity. If one considers Homo erectus, he left traces in the way in which he occupied space. He adapted areas for sleep, others for meals, etc., and mastered stone splitting much better than his predecessors Homo habilis and Homo ergaster. When humans produced radically different secondary traces, paleontologists qualified them as Homo sapiens. One can distinguish two types: the dexterous creative Neanderthal, possessing an elaborate language, and Cro-Magnon, who seemed more culturally and biologically equipped than the Neanderthal, and who survived him. Reeves H., Simonet D., Prologue de la plus belle histoire du monde, pages 165-166. The discovery of bodies makes it possible to observe that at each of these periods the body has been modified. The body has become taller and more upright. The brain has changed proportionally as tools have become more complex. This observation tends to confirm the definition of a systemic relationship existing between the production of external traces, here the technique, and the production of internal traces, here linked to the ever greater activation of neuronal connections. To find out more, one can visit the Museum of Marseille's website, from which the graph on the slide has been taken. Today, evolution continues. Technical, cultural, and social mutations engender increasingly interdependent systems. A new world, an artifact world, has appeared, engendering digital socialization. The systemic dynamic of the human trace continues its work. With a more or less intensive use of digital technology, the brain continues its transformation. Aware now of a link existing between the evolution of the brain and the interactions of human beings with their environment, the 21st century researcher closely examines the plasticity of the brain. Let us give the example of Dr. Hugues Dufault's study, which, based on human brain mapping and what brain tumour patients feel, he operates on the brain in total consciousness. By making patients express what they feel when he stimulates different parts of the open brain, he was able to pinpoint that while he was removing Broca's area, assumed to be that of speech, affected by the tumour, millimetre by millimetre, the patient continued to express himself in coherent sentences. He concluded from this that the relationship between the cartography of the brain and tasks accomplished should be called into question in the 21st century. We should note that Hugues Dufault is a university professor at Montpellier, a neurosurgeon and researcher in neurosciences, a field which examines the neurobiological mechanisms which underlie cognition, motor function, perception, emotions, reasoning, language, memory, etc. If you wish to know more about this operation, you can read H. Dufault's Le cerveau en toute conscience in Borgin L and Borgin J, Ces Français qui révolutionnent la médecine, édition de la Martinière, 2015. Broca's area, region in the frontal lobe of the dominant hemisphere, usually the left, of the hominid brain, with functions linked to speech production. You can see the photo in an animated version on the Commons Wikimedia website. This question is a long-standing one, as demonstrated by the case of Phineas Gage, 1848, which had previously led Dr. Penfield to ask questions about the functions of areas in the brain. On September 13, 1848, Phineas Gage, an American railroad worker, was injured in an explosion in which an iron rod passed through his brain. Against all expectations, he recovered from this accident, but his behavior was radically altered. By studying his injuries, scientists gained a better understanding of the functions of the frontal lobe. We can quote another experiment described in McGill University lectures and in the very terms of instruction on the brain. Dr. Penfield's experiments in stimulating the cortex enabled him to develop a complete map of the motor cortex, known as the motor homunculus. There are also other kinds, such as the sensory homunculus. The most striking aspect of this map is that the areas assigned to various body parts on the cortex are proportional not to their size, but rather to the complexity of the movements that they can perform. Hence, the areas for the hand and face are especially large compared with those for the rest of the body. This is no surprise, because the speed and dexterity of human hand and mouth movements are precisely what give us two of our most distinctly human faculties, the ability to use tools and the ability to speak. Coming back to Professor Dufour, he concluded that where the brain is concerned, one should not talk of areas, but of connections. These are capable of carrying out a reorganization of what remains after the ablation. His conclusion was that there is a cerebral plasticity and that the distribution of the brain's functions is not fixed. Post-operative imaging enabled him to see that the distribution of the brain's functions varied in the same patient taken at two different moments in his life. These are the terms used by H. Dufour. See the reference cited, page 43. Imaging also enabled him to observe that it varied from one patient to another. This observation is very interesting in relation to our hypotheses. It confirms the idea that every individual's interactions with his or her environment are unique and leave specific traces within the person's body. The processes of interaction are performed constantly, the bodily traces of interactions evolving with them. Certain traces of interactions are more striking than others, notably when the person is in a strong emotional state. In this case, they can be transformed into imprints that are transmissible over several generations, as emerging research in epigenetics proves, which show that the traces of traumatisms experienced 3 generations ago can be detected in the descendant's behavior. For more information, the following sources can be referred to, which correspond to the 2 successive illustrations. Richard C. Francis, Epigenetics, How Environment Shapes Our Genes, W. W. Norton and Company, edition, reprint, 15th of June, 2012. Fish, E. W., Sharrock, D., Baggott, R., Kalji, C., Brady, T., Ziff, M., and Meany, M. J., 2004. Epigenetic Programming of Stress Responses Through Variations in Maternal Care. Annals of the New York Academy of Science, 1036, 167 to 180. In conclusion, the ichnos anthropos, also known as the Human-Trace, human trace, to recall the French origin of the anthropological paradigm, encompasses the whole human species, in which it is conceived as carrying within it the traces of history, not only the history of humankind, but also that of the world. It therefore incorporates today's sapiens sapiens, as well as those that preceded it, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. It also includes the humans of tomorrow, who, traveling in space, will see their bodies modified through interactions with a different environment than the one they are familiar with today. The history of the human trace is not over. Each day that passes sees it evolve. It is impossible to predict its future, but one can believe that by having become aware of the anthropological characteristics of ichnoanthropos, it changes the perception of itself and its relationship with the environment. It becomes capable of understanding the role of the trace in sustainable development, not only that of humanity, but also that of the planet Earth within the cosmos. This is a considerable challenge. To take it up, all researchers working on trace, whatever their discipline, are invited to take part in the e-laboratoire Human-Trace Complex Systems. We hope that we have given you an incentive to take part in this wonderful scientific adventure. I'm now going to hand you over to two researchers who would like to become involved in the e-lab by organising exchanges in different fields relating to the question of trace. Dr. Maud Bonenfant, UQAM, Montreal, Canada, The Traces of Homo Ludens, and Professor Joel Colloch, UMR-IDES LH, Le Havre, France. Big Data, Homme-Trace et Profilage. Thank you for your attention.